ready, please do turn to Genesis chapter 50.
So today's reading is taken from Genesis chapter 50, verses 12 to 26. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Well, friends, revenge is normal, but perspective is not. Revenge is normal, but perspective, vision, God's vision, true sight, is not normal. It's extraordinary. So we've come to the end of this epic story of Joseph. We just finished reading to the end of Genesis there. And it's a story that we resonate with. We are part of this story. It is our story. We participate in it. I've mentioned before that Joseph leads God's people into Egypt, and then it's Moses who leads God's people out. When Egypt turns oppressive, Moses leads them out, and when they are led out, there's this Passover event, and then that event is celebrated in the Passover meal. The Passover meal is the meal that Jesus initiates, the Lord's Supper, that we are going to celebrate today. We are participating in this story. It is our story. And this story is like the most valuable diamond that's perfectly cut, and there's multiple sides to it and different angles that you can view this story from. It's quite a complex story. There's a lot going on. Many ways to view this beautiful, rich, and complex story. And today, my sense is that the view we need to take on that diamond, that beautiful story, is that revenge is normal, but perspective is not. So we all know that Joseph and his brothers did not get along. That's pretty normal in and of itself. Sibling rivalry is a pretty universal norm. But of course, their sibling rivalry was a pretty significant one. And for all of us, we kind of have a sense of equity and fairness. Things must be even in life. I mean, think about a cake, like a birthday cake or some other form of cake that you might be sharing, or even any other meal. But think about a cake. If you've got 8 people standing around a cake and you're there to cut it, what do you have to do? Well, you have to do one perfect cut right down the middle. Then you've got to do the cross cut across that, and then you've got to do 2 perfectly even cuts across that. So you get 8 even parts of the cake and everyone gets the same portion, right? That's how you cut a cake with 8 people. When you have 5 people around a cake, it's a little complicated to try and do the maths on that. It's a bit more complicated. If you have 2 people, I was told this actually, it's quite good advice, I thought. If you're sharing a meal, like some food, and you're having to share it between 2 people, one person gets to cut it and the other person gets to choose which part they get. Because that way there's incentive for the person cutting it not to just take a big, they want to get it right down the middle, so the other person will choose something pretty even. Anyway, it is such a strong drive from early childhood to have this sense of everything must be fair and even and equitable. And so it can come as quite a shock when it seems that God is raising up certain individuals into leadership positions. Certain individuals end up with more of a blessing. Joseph has these dreams that elevate him above his brothers and even his parents, and God fulfills those dreams. God does elevate him above his brothers and his parents. God drives this magnificent story forward, taking broken and messed up humanity forward out of darkness and into the light. But it does look like unfairness. It's not equitable, and the brothers hate this. Their sense of justice is totally fired up by the special treatment that Joseph gets, and so they want to give Joseph their own special treatment to even up the score. Initially they want to kill him off, but end up selling him into slavery as though he is dead and tell everyone that he is. They can't stand the idea that he would get more cake in life. So in their anger, they want to bring that balance back in the score. But of course, as is pretty much always the case, when we try and even up the score, when we try and balance things, we tend to overcompensate. We don't just cut down the tall poppy. You know, tall poppy syndrome, someone stands up taller than everyone else. It's like a beautiful Australian thing to do, is cut down the tall poppy. We don't just cut them down to our size. What happens is they just get cut off. They get cut down lower. We overdo it. And we know for Joseph, it sets off a horror chain of events for him. But somehow that chain of events God uses to save his people from an even bigger crisis, this widespread famine that would have obliterated the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They would have been wiped off the map. If they hadn't have died, they would have ended up in utter slavery and the name would have been gone. The name Israel, we would not know it. A nation would not have been born if it wasn't for this embryonic development in Egypt. Now, Israel is the name of a person. It's the second name that was given to Jacob later in his life. And now, as the book of Genesis comes to a close, Jacob has died in Egypt, and so now his sons are fulfilling their father's wishes to bury him back in Canaan. I'm not sure if I've counted correctly, but I think in total for the Joseph story, there's 8 journeys, like from Canaan into Egypt or back the other way. If you were to draw it on a map, it's just like playing table tennis in between Canaan and Egypt. Anyway, the name Israel has finished being the name of a man and is now becoming a family name and the name of a nation. At this point, it changes. It's no longer just the name of a man, it's becoming the name of a nation. But this family has so many problems. So many problems. And along the way, they've just picked up all of these problems. And deception has been such a part of their family. The brothers and Joseph have torn themselves apart. And Joseph, he's done this extraordinary work of reconciliation, giving them a second chance to prove their character. And they have been reconciled to some degree. Joseph has wept. They've had a dinner party together. They've celebrated together. And now they've buried their father together. There is a great sense of togetherness. And still, the brothers know that they have deeply wronged Joseph. They have deeply wronged Joseph. They've sinned against him in a way that hasn't been reconciled. They have an unpaid debt of that injustice they caused him way back when they were younger. They know that retaliation is normal and expected. The most normal thing to expect of Joseph is that he would hold a grudge. And he's in an incredible position of power. So the brothers have thrown themselves down in front of him on the ground. And he is the most powerful man, basically. He's running the entire known world. He is in charge. He has all the control. He could just say the word and they'll be in prison or worse. They know that. They know that retaliation is normal. And here's what happens. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, and I think this is actually a complete fabrication. So I think they make this up. It's not actually Jacob's words, their father's words. They're just trying to protect themselves. They say, "Your father left these instructions before you." They're making up his last will and testament. This is what you are to say to Joseph. "I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." So the brothers have made this up to protect themselves. They're using the voice of their dead father to extract forgiveness. Now we might think that's a bit dramatic and a bit over the top, but they don't. They know this is serious. They know their lives are on the line. In the next book of the Bible, Exodus, so we've just finished Genesis, the next book of the Bible, Exodus, in there's a principle that gets enshrined in the law of Moses. And there's this principle that gets laid down and this is what it says. If there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. That gets laid down as a law. Now, to us, that might sound a little bit harsh and violent. It's actually a gracious accommodation to restrict violence getting out of control. Because the normal thing is to retaliate. Someone takes an eye, but what ends up taking, you don't take an eye back, you take a life. And that's how wars and things, feuds last centuries between families, and they escalate. Because violence just grows and extends. So this law is laid down, eye for eye, to stop it getting out of control. You can't do anything beyond taking equal. It's a limitation on the normal practice when revenge always gets out of control. Now, this hasn't taken effect yet. So this is after Joseph. So the brothers don't have this limitation and control. So they know this Joseph can take more. They could take their life. They don't have this control and this limitation and this context to live in. Revenge is normal, but perspective is not. And Joseph has some extraordinary perspective. He has been through a lot. He's had a rough life. He's forgotten some dreams, but then God goes and fulfills them anyway, and in ways that he would never have imagined. He's in charge of Egypt, and God brought that about. He was in the worst of circumstances, and yet he witnessed and experienced God's transforming power to break through his shattered life and turn it for incredible good. Joseph is utterly powerless, and it turns in an instant into great authority and privilege. So Joseph now knows that God sees differently. God sees a long view, and he can turn things for good in an instant. He could see that God's vision and God's plan is so far beyond the horizon of our day-to-day lives. God takes our suffering and overwhelms it with salvation. And so Joseph now has this quite unique and extraordinary perspective. He was brought in to see some of what God sees. I used to go to Melbourne Uni, and a friend and I, we used to like driving in every once in a while just for something fun to do. And we thought we were pretty special because we found all-day free parking near Melbourne Uni, which, if you know Melbourne, that's kind of impressive. So this is in Carlton. How do you find all-day free parking? It might not be the case anymore, so this is probably not a tip for anyone who's looking for free parking. I think it's probably changed. But anyway, we found all-day free parking on the road just north of the Melbourne Cemetery, which is right near Melbourne Uni. So it was a short walk to get there, and so we were pretty proud of ourselves. You just had to get there before a certain time in the morning, which was fine for us. It worked all right. But part of the reason I liked parking there was actually the walk past the cemetery. To start my day walking past all these tombstones of people who had been striving in their life, who had accomplished amazing things, who perhaps had extraordinary wealth. Like to have some of those tombstones, you got to have a lot of cash. And what does their life come to? When you put it in an eternal perspective, to be faced with your mortality, to start your day and to face the mortality, it stopped me striving for some silly things. There are some things that are just a chasing after the wind. They're meaningless, and yet we spend so much of our life doing them, so much of our energy and our focus. We get wrapped up in these things. In the end, come to nothing. And so to start my day, when I'm going in to learn about the universe and all these things, to start my day having that reset happen of what is really important, to have an eternal perspective on things, and to start striving for some things that I hadn't been striving for. I remember distinctly one day where I was a bit cut up by someone else. Someone else had wronged me. And I started my day, I was grumpy, we're driving in, and we get there and walking past the cemetery. And it just changed my perspective. Why do I care? When I'm dead and gone, does it really matter if I even up this score here? Does it really matter if I need to confront this person about it? Perspective is powerful, but it's not normal. Perspective can be life-changing, and Joseph had a life-changing perspective, and it shifted how he related to his brothers. The brothers are trying to extract forgiveness from him, and then it says, when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Revenge is normal, but perspective is not. Look carefully at what this perspective does to Joseph. Firstly, he weeps. So perspective, a big perspective of what God is up to, means he is relationally, emotionally connected to what is going on. He's caring about relationships, and so he weeps. He relieves fear. So he says to his brothers, don't worry, don't be anxious. He relieves their fear. Thirdly, he steps out of a godlike status. So Joseph is in a powerful position where many of us can find ourselves, where we are in a position over others. They've fallen down in front of him, and he's very powerful. The danger is that he can be God in that situation. And he deliberately steps out of it and says, am I like God? No. He doesn't take the temptation to be God. Fourthly, he says, I will provide for you and your children. So this perspective means he hands out blessing instead of punishment. He turns that around entirely. He provides for them and their children. And then finally, he reassures them and speaks kindly to them. It's like the last thing you would expect after what they've done to him. He speaks kindly to them and reassures them. So that's what his perspective and vision does. That's the outcome. And that all comes from the perspective that he has. That amazing little passage there. It says, and this is what he sees. This is his perspective. You intended to harm me, which is what everyone would see. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph sees the salvation story. He's living in the salvation story. He has a role to play. He has a part in that salvation story. And because he sees that, it completely changes how he can relate to others. People who are his enemy, he can relate differently to them. Revenge is normal, but perspective is not. So how do we get this perspective? How can we have this life-changing perspective? What is that for us? Well, God has been taking his people on a really long journey that is full of good news. Good news. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth was good news. It limited violence. It stopped the cycle of uncontrolled violence and escalating violence. But then the greatest news of all came. The Son of God stepped into our humanity. He stepped fully into our perspective so that it could be expanded and we would see God's perspective. And Jesus Christ comes along and teaches us, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. That is not normal. That is incredible perspective to be able to do that. Where does that come from? Well, we know Jesus, after that, got himself killed, and he rises to new life on the other side of it. And he secures our own resurrection. So we have resurrection secured for us on the other side of death. God turns our worst fear, the fear of death, into a triumph of life. And so we have an eternal perspective. Which means when evil people do things to harm us, when anyone does things to harm us, we don't need to even the score. We don't need to spend each and every day trying to account for things being out of balance. We don't need to chase down every wrongdoing and obsess over every cent owed to us. We can actually die with people owing us a great debt, and we can let go of caring because we're about to receive and inherit the most abundant wealth, heavenly wealth. We get to inherit everything. And of course, we forgive because we've been forgiven our most shameful of sins. This perspective, this vision that we have of seeing our Saviour dying in our place, taking on himself the things that we deserve, wiping our slate clean and giving us a fresh start, that gives us the most amazing new lease on life. It doesn't take us back to the start again. It takes us forward into a new reality, a new way of living that brings transformation to a broken and hurting world. We get to live in the salvation story and have that perspective. It's an eternal story. We have the most amazing privilege and opportunity to work for forgiveness, reconciliation, to turn enemies into friends by loving them. And even if they don't, to keep loving them anyway. Because what have we got to lose? We have secured every inheritance already. So friends, may you have this extraordinary perspective. May you see the gospel and know the gospel in your heart and to live it out. The good news of Jesus Christ who changes everything. May you be released from the burden of grudges and revenge to live in the freedom of forgiveness and making friends out of enemies. Amen.